I recently visited Poland for the first time, and I was obviously on the lookout for some fun language stuff. I have a close friend who's Polish, and some of my partner's family still live in Poland, and so it's always been one of the languages I've been interested in learning. I tried to read random words from signs as we walked, and I spent the plane journey back practicing the distinction between the sh and sh sounds. Please, any Polish people watching, feel free to critique my pronunciation. And I also found myself spotting possible cognates between Polish and English. I'm not talking about obvious recent borrowings, like words both English and Polish speakers learned from Latin. To explain what I do mean, I'll just start giving some examples, and if you want to know more about how we know what I'm about to tell you, I have a separate video on that. My knowledge of the history of Slavic phonology is not as good as my knowledge of the history of English phonology, so some of the dates in my timeline, especially towards the more recent end, might not be exact. So if you have any criticisms there, feel free to put them in the comments. But otherwise, I hope it's good enough to be educational and fun. About 5,000 years ago, probably in the far east of Europe, a culture of people existed, and in their language they had the word chultnach to refer to the stuff that sheep are covered in. Some people from this culture migrated to other lands. We'll think of two of these groups as the red group and the blue group, because we don't know what they called themselves. These two groups, of course, still interacted with sheep and still used the word chultnach to refer to this useful substance that grows on them. For some amount of time, we don't really know how long, maybe decades, maybe hundreds of years, the word was probably pronounced more or less the same in both cultures. But then, eventually, in conversational speech, subtle changes started to happen. In the blue culture, people stopped pronouncing the as its own syllable nucleus, chultnach, and they started inserting a vowel in there, chultnach. They probably didn't even realise they were doing it, although maybe the older generation complained it's not chultnach, it's chultnach, talk properly, or something like that. That kind of social detail, of course, we'll never really know. In the red culture, a similar thing was taking place. People were starting to break up that sequence with an U sound, chultnach. If people from the two cultures had ever met each other, which it's perfectly possible that they did, they may have registered this as a slight difference in regional accent. Chultnach versus chultnach. After some indeterminate length of time, people in the red culture continued doing what people do all the time and started not really bothering with those dorsal consonants. Maybe this happened at first during rapid conversational speech, and then as toddlers grew up and heard adults doing this more and more, they perceived that as the proper way of saying the word. No longer chultnach, but wulna. People in the blue culture undertook a similar change. Chultnach became wilna, and eventually wilna. People in the red culture stopped doing that discontinuous glottal stop in the middle of the word, wulna, and started just turning it into a colourless vowel, perhaps because it was just easier to keep their vocal cords buzzing the whole way through. Woolana. Perhaps if people from the two cultures met each other now, people from the red culture would think that the blue culture's word sounded weirdly creaky and throaty. Wilna. And people from the blue culture would think the red culture's word sounded babyish or like they couldn't be bothered to say it properly. Woolana. We can only speculate, of course. In any case, things are becoming a bit more dateable now. Probably by some point in the first millennium BCE, these traces of those original laryngeal consonants were probably gone. People in the blue culture were just saying wilna, and people in the red culture were saying wulna. Still, almost like the same word said in two different regional accents, wilna, wulna. Speakers in the red culture started to simplify certain consonant clusters. Speakers emerged who, rather than saying wulna, said wulla. The blue dialect underwent its own change, going from saying wilna to rilna. The words between the two cultures are now fairly substantially different, wulla versus rilna, and any further change that the speakers slowly make compounded that difference. Speakers in the red culture rounded their lips on that final vowel. They went from wulla to wullo, and then eventually the vowel shortens, wullu, And slowly but surely, because it's in a position of low stress, speakers just don't bother saying it altogether. Wool. In the blue culture, this labiodental approximant, r, has completely hardened into a v sound. Vilna. Within the last few hundred years, the red culture keep their word fairly stable as wool, while some small sound changes still churn on in the blue culture. Velna, velna, and eventually speakers start vocalizing that u sound, producing the modern Polish word velna against the modern English word wool, although that same L vocalization is happening in English, at least in my dialect, so many of us in rapid speech say wool. In Polish, this happened long enough ago that it's now part of the standard prescribed language. Velna is the standard Polish pronunciation of the word. In English, it's still an ongoing sound change, and so wool is still a little bit stigmatized sometimes. Of course, this isn't the end of the line for sound change, it's just the point that we've got to at the time I'm making this video. And there are a few important caveats. For the first few thousand years of these sound changes, we have what my archaeology lecturer used to call a floating chronology. We know roughly what order the sound changes must have happened in, because some of them are contingent on others already having happened, and if they'd happened in a different order, the outcomes in modern Polish and English would be different. But we don't know how to staple this sequence onto real historical dates. So for all we know, the word might have been completely unchanged in the blue culture until, in the space of 300 years, all the sound changes happened really quickly, or they might have been spread over the whole 2,000 years or so. So any comparisons I drew there aren't necessarily historically accurate, in the sense that the blue and red culture might not have said those words that way at that exact time. I'm just trying to paint a picture of how things might have gone in those early millennia. More recently, of course, we have the spelling choices and sometimes explicit phonetic descriptions of native speakers to go on. Why don't we look at some other examples? In that common culture 5,000 years ago, there must have been a word like derwom. This probably referred to these things, which again exist everywhere. So when our common culture split into the red and blue populations, because they had to talk about derwoms a lot, they both continued using the word. In the red population, as far as we can tell, the word remained broadly the same for 2,500 years, possibly with some undetectable little changes here and there. In the blue branch, we see more of the normal changes that happen generation on generation. Derwom becomes derwam, becomes derwa, becomes derwo. This probably happened too gradually for people to really notice much, generation on generation, as I said. Then, probably in the first millennium BCE, the red culture began saying a lot of their consonants differently. Derwom, remember they preserved the old pronunciation, became terwom. Again, you can imagine this being the kind of change that old people might have got annoyed about younger people doing. Shortly afterwards, people started stressing words on the first syllable. Instead of terwom, you get terwom. And then this vowel lost its lip rounding in the last syllable. Terwam. This is similar to what's happened in much of American English, where on has become an. All the m sounds at the ends of words started changing to n sounds, so we now have terwan. This might seem like a weird change, but I'd say it's quite similar to the modern English sound change where singing becomes singin. One type of nasal consonant just turns into another. At a similar time, we see a sound change in the blue culture where that w sound becomes a labiodental approximant. So older derwo becomes dervo. So you have dervo and terwan. In some languages at this point, this word had probably already evolved in meaning somewhat. Rather than referring to the large woody plant, it referred to one of the useful substances that you could get from that plant. So in the blue culture, dervo still meant this, but in the blue culture, terwan meant this. In the red culture, we see a sound change where that final nasal gets absorbed into the vowel, producing a nasal vowel. Older speakers might have noticed younger speakers pronouncing terwan as terwan. Eventually, the final nasal vowel got dropped altogether, and this w sound was preserved, but because it was now hanging at the end of the word, it seems to have developed into a proper vowel rather than a semi-vowel. Terwan, teru, teru. By the time the red culture actually starts using the Roman alphabet to write these words down, that first vowel, the e, seems to have undergone a natural process of assimilation. E has a front tongue position, and the final vowel, u, has a back tongue position. And often in this situation, speakers will start to move their tongue towards the back tongue position while they're still making the first vowel. This produces something like teru. Meanwhile, people in the blue culture are hardening that labiodental approximant, ra, into a labiodental fricative. Dervo becomes dervo. You know how some people say arcs instead of ask? Well, that's called metathesis, when two sounds flip places, and it's actually quite common and visible in the spellings of words in older languages. Here, the blue culture starts doing it systematically, and dervo becomes drevo. Another thing that might have annoyed older people. It should be dervo, not drevo. By this point, speakers of the two languages may have been basically unable to recognize the word in the other culture because so many sound changes had stacked up that set them apart, and because they now meant two different things. The blue culture's drevo meant this, and the red culture's teru meant this. But we're still about 1,000 years off the modern situation. In the blue culture, the r sound became somewhat palatalized, drevo, and in the red, this gliding vowel or diphthong collapsed into a monophthong, turu, which then lost its lip rounding, teru. The blue language turned this palatalized r sound into a fricative, something roughly like jevo, while the red language lowered that first vowel and centralized the unstressed one, tara. So you now have the significantly different jevo versus tara. It's the red culture that now undergoes a pretty quick sequence of changes, and this is in the last 600 years or so, so people were actually describing those changes in writing as they happened. People stopped bothering with that unstressed vowel in tara, producing tar, and then the vowel raised a little bit, and the r sound weakened to an approximant, giving tar. In the 1700s, working class people in London, which was where some of the red culture now lived, started to drop the r sound and had retracted the a sound, giving something like tar. And this change became standard as that ingliding diphthong turned into the smooth vowel that I use today, tar. In Polish, the fricative r sound has ended up as a kind of weird, almost retroflexed sound that I hope I pronounce properly, jevo. The English word tar still means this stuff, and the Polish word jevo still means this thing. So what about the English word for this thing? Well, let's go back to the common ancestor language 5,000 years ago. This language had different ways of forming words in different contexts. We call this a system of ablaut. And derwom wasn't the only form of this word. There was also drewom. It was this drewom word that continued to be used in the red culture to describe this thing. Like with the word for tar, it stayed largely unchanged for the first couple of thousand years before that mass consonant change turned the d into a t. Trewom. That om ending went through the same sequence of systematic sound changes, becoming first trewom, and then trewon, and then trewon. And then we hit the first big point of difference. The a disappears, as it did with the other word and most other words that had that ending, and it left the w exposed at the end of the word. But because the w was preceded by a vowel in this form, e, it now formed a gliding vowel or diphthong, treu. Like the other diphthongs in this stage of the red language, it underwent a process called height harmonization, where that last element of the diphthong, the u part, took on the same tongue height as the e part, producing something like treo. The word in Old English was spelled T-R-E-O-W, sometimes without the W. This diphthong smoothed into a front vowel with lip rounding, tre, and then lost the lip rounding, tre. A large-scale change in the long vowels in the middle of the last millennium turned it into tri, and since then the r has become a r, the vowel has become a slight diphthong, e, and at least in my accent the t has palatalized to a ch, producing tree against Polish drzewo. Now let's go for what I found to be a slightly surprising one. The ancestral culture probably had a word something like giombos, which probably referred to this and perhaps also this. Soon after the two populations split apart, they progressed this j sound differently. The blue culture progressed it to something vaguely like zh, and the red culture progressed it to g. Historical linguists now call these sound changes satemization and centimization respectively, because Indo-European languages can be broadly split into two groups based on how their ancestors treated these original j sounds. So you now have the blue population saying something like jombos, and the red population saying something like gombos. The red population probably stuck with more or less this pronunciation for a very long time, while in the blue population the word underwent a relatively rapid series of changes. First of all, this voiced aspirate, b, which I'm really bad at pronouncing, just collapsed into a normal b sound, producing jombos. Then this vowel in the first syllable lost its lip rounding and took a lower tongue position, jambos, and this first consonant turned into a normal sibilant fricative, zambos. At this fairly early stage, then, the red and blue languages were already pronouncing the word quite differently. Zambos versus gombos. The blue culture absorbed their m into the vowel, creating a long nasal vowel, zabos, and then, as nasal vowels often do, it took a more back tongue position and lip rounding, zambos. At first in rapid conversational speech, and then generally, the final s was eroded away, zambo. All the while, we're still probably hearing gombos from the red population, although even though the red population had probably preserved a pretty conservative pronunciation, the meaning had been reframed. People at some stage started referring to this as a gombos, probably because it looks like a little row of teeth or pegs. At long last, something changes in the red language. That large-scale shift in consonants that we've seen a couple of times before turns the g into a k, and turns that voiced aspirated b, which I'm bad at pronouncing, into a normal b. Combos. Meanwhile, the final vowel in the blue culture had been weakened, zambu. That last vowel got eroded away, producing zamb, and in the red culture the final s got voiced to a z, combos. That nasal vowel in the blue culture shortens, giving zob, while those rounded vowels in the red culture lose their lip rounding, giving combos. For the last couple of thousand years, the blue culture keeps the word relatively stable, while the red culture starts to seriously change it. Zab, comba, zab, comb, zab, comb, zob, comb. Then in the red language, final mb clusters get simplified to just m, giving calm. That large-scale vowel change I talked about for other words takes place, and this long vowel raises in tongue height, calm, while the blue language rounds this vowel and devoices the final consonant, zop. And finally, we arrive at the modern situation. The red culture breaks this vowel into a diphthong, comb, comb, and the blue culture breaks up this nasal vowel into a sequence of a normal oral vowel followed by a m, zomp. So you have comb and zomp. Now this is one where I expect maybe a bit of skepticism. The words sound quite different and mean quite different things, so isn't it a bit of a reach to suggest that they're ancestrally the same word? Well, as you'll know if you've watched these videos before, the sound changes I'm describing aren't just random tailor-made sound changes that linguists have designed to make it look like specific words have evolved in specific ways. They're systematic, so they apply generally across all words that evolved from the ancestor language to Polish or from the ancestor language to English. This initial change where g turns into j in the Polish branch and g in the English branch applies across many words, not just this one. If you have the ancestral word giombos and run it through these systematic sound changes, you would expect the Polish reflex to sound like zomp, and you would expect the English reflex to sound like comb. These are just the expected deterministic outcomes of those sound changes. Changes in meaning are less systematic and meaning is more abstract, but parallel changes can be seen more recently. To most of us in English, a brush is an implement that you use to clean the dirt from something or neaten your hair, but dialectally in English, brush could also refer to a fox's tail. Given the systematic correspondence between the two words, it's not hard to imagine that people might have started thinking of a comb as like a little row of teeth. The next word we'll cover is gordos, which probably meant something like enclosure. Again, the blue population makes a few of the earliest changes. These voiced aspirated consonants turn into normal voiced consonants, gordos. Those vowels lose their lip rounding, gardas, and then they seem to gain it again, gordos. Then, in the red culture, we have that large-scale consonant change in the first millennium BCE that we've seen in a few other words. The initial g turns into a fricative, r, and the voiced aspirate turns into a normal voiced d, gordos. The final s turns into a z, as we've seen in other words, gordos. And meanwhile, the blue culture loses that final consonant altogether, gordo. So you now have gordo, gordos. In the red culture, as usual, those vowels with lip rounding lose it, gordos, and then that ending slowly erodes away, gorda, gord. The blue culture weakens that last vowel, gordo. The red culture changes that first vowel so it has a front tongue position instead of a back one, gard. And you can see that at some point here, the r has become velarized as well. We then once again get that metathesis in the blue language, where a vowel and a r swap places, producing grodu. The final vowel erodes away, grod. In the red culture, you get a fairly quick sequence of changes. The vowel assimilates to this velarized r, so it's now a diphthong that glides from a front to a back tongue position, gard. And then the consonant at the start palatalizes, yard, and then yard. So you now have two fairly different words, yard and grod. In the blue culture, the vowel lengthens, grod. In the red culture, the vowel smooths, yard. In the blue culture, the vowel shortens again but raises in tongue position, grod. In the red culture, the vowel fronts and raises slightly, and the r becomes an approximant yard. In the blue culture, like with other words, this final d devoices to t, grot. In the red culture, like in other words, the vowel is retracted and the r starts to disappear, yard. Finally, that vowel in the red culture smooths, giving modern English yard, and the vowel in the blue culture raises even more, giving modern Polish grut. The modern Polish word means city, the modern English word obviously means yard, but the connection between the two meanings is more obvious in this case. Polish also has a word ogród, which means garden, and in American English the word yard can mean something similar to garden, in the sense of a back garden of a house. The earlier meaning of enclosure can still be seen in Old English texts and is a bit more diverse in older written Germanic languages in general. This is the same root that you see in Old Norse Asgardr, Asgard, the realm of a certain group of god figures. Polish grut is also cognate with the grat in Russian Stalingrad. That's it for this video. Thank you to anyone who chooses to subscribe after watching it. Subscribing doesn't always mean that you'll get shown videos nowadays, so clicking the bell icon as well makes it more likely you'll be shown future things if you'd like to be. And a big thanks as well to anyone who supports my Patreon very kindly, or my Substack or any of the other outlets that I have for this stuff. Otherwise, I hope you're all alright in these increasingly difficult times for many people. and I will be back soon.